I just wanted to say thank you all for joining me today. And I know that's the final week of classes too, so it is a pretty hectic moment. So thank you to everyone here in the audience and also who is joining us on Zoom. I appreciate that. So I'll be speaking today to share some pretty recent findings about hunter-gatherer plant management, that comes from specifically on the Columbia Plateau. I'll be talking from niche construction as well as traditional ecological knowledge perspectives. And I'm mostly interested in Camas. So as you can see on the background here, a little bit faded, Camas is a perennial plant with an edible bulb, and it grows throughout the region, and it is blooming in some places, and it should be blooming pretty soon too. So we'll soon be able to see these fields of blue against the mountains. It's really beautiful. So I'll be using 2 case studies today. So most of my research is in the Pandare Valley in northeastern Washington state. And then I also have preliminary results from the Willamette Valley in Oregon as well. And so both places are very well known for their Camas fields and the archaeological record of Camas exploitation. In both geographic and cultural locations, I will be arguing that people were selectively harvesting Camas primarily based on the relative sexual maturity rather than bulb size. So much of research previously has looked at the size of the plant that you're harvesting rather than relative maturity too. And so I argue that people are prioritizing sexual maturity rather than size, and that these practices really begin around 3,500 years ago in both locations. And I'll also show, contrary to many niche construction explanations of domestication and management, that iteratively and repetitively harvesting and sowing and resowing of Camas actually doesn't lead to any form of directional or phenotypic change within the bulb itself, and that this is a really interesting alternative pathway in the domestication literature as well too. And so the primary paper that this talk does derive from actually was just published about a week ago, which is pretty exciting. And I do have some preliminary results too from an expansion, and I hope to make that a little bit bigger, but I'm looking forward to sharing with everyone today. So this study was actually inspired by quite a significant interest right now in how different plant species and different plant communities all throughout the Western North America were often managed or otherwise cared for by traditional groups, by Native American and First Nation groups. And so this interest really comes out of larger food sovereignty and food security movements, as many groups are working to augment and expand the presence of traditional foods in their diets too, for health and cultural reasons. And so Camas grows everywhere. It grows much throughout Western North America. There's even a species that grows in Eastern North America as well too. And it was very commonly consumed across many different cultural groups. And there are some estimates that put Camas as up to 25 to even 70% of the diet at different points in time as well too. So there's quite a bit of extraordinary economic and cultural importance for this plant with many tribal nations as well too. And this is why there's a lot of interest in revitalizing the plant, understanding how it might have been managed or cared for within fields, and also how it was prepared to as part of these larger ongoing food security movements that are going on right now. So this work is also inspired by many Native American and First Nation scholars and writers and thinkers too. And so Robin Kimmerer, who I have her book on the screen, she is a botanist and also a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. And so her book is actually pretty popular right now. I see a lot of people talking about it. My mom was talking to me about it the other day that she just seen on the internet. But one of Kimmerer's main arguments is just that we should be weaving 3 different strands of knowledge. And so traditional knowledge, Western scientific knowledge, and then what she calls the plant knowledge. And so by traditional ecological knowledge, I'm referring to any form of knowledge that is garnered or worked on by an indigenous or local group over hundreds to even thousands of years. Where we have Western scientific knowledge is what we're a little bit more familiar with, the basic hypothesis testing, making observations about the world, making sure our work is replicable, the one that drives much research today too. And then Kimmerer actually identifies a third form of knowledge too, which she calls plant knowledge. And so plant knowledge really seeks to understand what is the plant trying to do? What is the plant's agenda? How does a plant react within a particular environment? And that we need to use all three forms of knowledge to really open up greater understandings of the natural world around us too. And so the study that I will be sharing today does use traditional ecological knowledge as the basis of my hypotheses. I do use plant knowledge to help prove my ultimate argument that people were selectively harvesting these sexually mature bulbs. And then I also use Western scientific knowledge and niche construction theory in particular too, to really help bring all of this together. So I'd like to quickly start with a little plant knowledge. Also life history traits. And so this is life history as it comes out of ecologies too. So just thinking about how a plant allocates energy over the course of its lifetime, both on annual cycles, as well as, because Camas is a perennial, throughout the entire course of its life. So Camas is a perennial plant and it grows throughout our region, and it actually is comprised of 5 different species throughout the US, and it grows up into southern Canada, but there are 2 species which are the most common. So here we have common Camas on the left, grows everywhere, and then we have great Camas, or I guess that would be the left, I'm not sure. But we have great Camas is the other one as well too. And so great Camas is a little bit bigger, although it does primarily grow west of the Cascades. So there are pockets here and there east of the Cascades as well. And both grow out of bulbs, which are edible, large, showy blue flowers, which usually bloom in May or early spring. And both species, in fact, all Camas species really prefer to live in what we call poorly drained fields or prairies, often with xeric moisture regimes. So wet and cold winters, warm and dry summers too. And that drought period is pretty important in the Camas life cycle as well too. And so those 2 species are pretty difficult to tell apart. I personally found it can be a little bit challenging too, based on the criteria that exist. And just thinking about nomenclature too within linguistic groups among many Native American and First Nation tribes too, they actually never really distinguished between the 2 species within their own folk taxonomies too. And this is also interesting too, because Camas really easily hybridizes. So our definitions of what is a Camas species too may eventually change as time goes on. But Camas is a bulb, and all bulbs are actually underground leaf bases. So I have on the screen too, as you might be able to see, and I can get the mouse going too, just a cross section of what this really looks like, an idealized cross section. So you can see that there are layers, which are also referred to sometimes as leaves or leaf scales. So I'll use the term leaf scales throughout just to refer to this particular feature. And so I found a good way to explain this feature to people who might not be as familiar with botany, is that if you've ever seen Shrek says to Donkey that ogres are like onions, they have layers. And so all bulbs have layers too, and Camas is one of them. And these layers are actually how we're able to determine how old a bulb was when it was harvested, and that's how we can get at management in the past. And so I'll return to this as we continue to go on. And then another just quick Camas fact as well too. So there is a mother bulb and a daughter bulb. So this would be the mother bulb, and this is the daughter bulb in here too. And so throughout the annual round or the annual cycle too, the bulb is largest at midsummer, then the plant rests. And then as seasons change to winter, the plant will draw on the stored carbohydrates within the bulb itself. And then in the spring, it'll pull through the bulb, and it'll be kind of squishy if you happen to harvest it in late winter. But then in the spring, the daughter bulb will actually go full and fully replace the mother bulb, and it will grow a little bit bigger every time too. And so that's how we can also look at how old a bulb is in the archaeological record. And so many factors have shown that there are a lot of influences on how big a Camas bulb can grow. So we know topography can affect how big a bulb grows. We know that pH has an impact on bulb size as well too. So that is just, bulb size is just not a great variable to look at archaeologically for these kinds of questions. But we do know that Camas reproduces primarily by seed actually, so sexually, but about 15% of all plants will reproduce asexually too. And if you damage a bulb when you're harvesting, for example, if you happen to clip it a little bit, it's actually much more likely to reproduce asexually as well with those offset bulbs, offset shoots too. We also know that they have quite a long life cycle with respect to perennials as well, too, because it takes 4 to 5 years for these bulbs to actually reach sexual maturity and to go to seed and produce seeds. And again, they have those interior layered leaf scales. And I have recently published a paper too that looked at many of the edible bulbs throughout Western North America and was trying to put together some of these life history traits. And I did find that both immature bulbs and mature bulbs, they actually have statistically significant different numbers of leaf scales inside of them too. And so it's not as straightforward as tree rings. That would be really nice if it was. But we do know that the older bulbs will usually have 4 or more leaf scales too, and the younger ones will usually have 2 to 3. And so we can use that too to really get at, how old roughly was this plant when people were harvesting it. And this is really useful too, because these life history traits help in establishing some quantifiable measures that allow us to look at some ethnographic behaviors of management to see how far those behaviors might have extended into the past and to see if they've changed at all through time. So I'm also interested in traditional ecological knowledge as well. And so there are quite a number of ethnographic and historic and even contemporary sources which describe how Camas has been managed in the past in ways that are probably pretty similar to our understandings of horticulture or gardening. And so, for example, there are many descriptions of taking care of Camas that suggest that fields were intentionally burned too, to move through and recycle specific nutrients and carbon back into the soil. We know that that would work to remove competitors and that people were probably actively going into Camas fields and removing competitors as well too. There are specific literature suggestions where people might have been actually amending the soils, that the act of digging or harvesting would have worked to aerate soils and effectively till it as well too. And then finally, there are many descriptions of how Camas is actually harvested, and many of these descriptions suggest that it was harvested in midsummer. And so in midsummer, after the plant has already flowered, it'll go to seed. And so you can go through a Camas field and identify the seed capsules and identify the mature bulbs from those seed capsules that are sticking out on the ground. And that's where you can go in with your digging stick and pop out the correct bulb that you're looking for. And so many descriptions, and I've also experienced this myself too, is that when you go through and you harvest Camas, you'll actually break off that stem and you'll replant the seeds while you're going through. And if you pop out any other immature bulbs too, you'll put them back in the soil too, and then keep moving on too. And this is a way that people talk about ensuring future harvests. And so all of these behaviors, though, we have on the screen, burning and removing competitors and digging and tilling soils and replanting seeds as you go through, these are all modifying an environment. They're really constructing a niche for Camas that makes it conducive to Camas growth too, which brings me to niche construction. So just quick run through of niche construction, just in our Western scientific perspective. Niche construction provides a pretty powerful explanatory framework for understanding how and why humans and species enter into what we call mutualistic or symbiotic relationships. And so niche construction theory covers these interactions which have transformed the genomes of species, which have transformed landscapes as well too, as people enter into these co-evolutionary feedback loops. And niche construction is a great way to understand many of these domestication or management questions about how different species change as people continue to interact with them. And so some scholars have argued that our terms for plant management, which just intentional human actions or input or engagement with plant organisms and their environment, usually to achieve some sort of subsistence goal, but that these terms of plant management are really just synonymous with niche construction, just another term for what's going on too. And so, I don't think that an entire single framework will explain all instances of management or domestication, but given that these traditional descriptions align so closely with many niche constructing activities, it is a very useful way of understanding and explaining human-plant or human-Camas relationships in the past. So today I'm testing just one of those traditional descriptions and niche constructing behaviors. And so I'm looking at, again, relative sexual maturity of bulbs too. So in the paper, we framed our hypotheses as potential strategies that we were looking for in the archaeological record. And so our first strategy, which we called stripping, is just that if people are harvesting bulbs regardless of maturity, I would really expect to see quite a wide range of leaf scales. And so this would be leaf scales indicative of bulbs harvested at all parts of their ages, potential ages too. And so we call this strategy stripping, and we're thinking about it, and we think that this strategy might be a little bit more time and labor efficient at one site if you're just pulling everything that you encounter, but this would actually deplete resources within local environments, particularly since it does take 4 to 5 years to grow back too. So alternatively, if people are harvesting primarily mature bulbs, like our ethnography does suggest and our traditional descriptions do suggest, we would see primarily mature leaf scale numbers within our archaeological bulbs. And we do think that this practice of resowing or replanting, which we would have to infer right now, but that it would ultimately take more time each time you go through to break off the capsule and replant everything and then move on. But that would allow you to return to a Camas field probably much more quickly, maybe within a year or 2 years. You might have to let the field fallow for a moment, but then you could come back pretty quickly. And so you're also ensuring that you will be able to come back to future harvests and future food for your family. And then we framed it as either or strategies in the paper. And the more I thought about it too, I think it's probably more of a spectrum. Human behavior is much more nuanced than either or too. But for the paper and for this first testing of the methodology in this first pilot study, we kept it at pretty simple stripping and selective harvesting. So I do most of my research with the Kalispel tribe in the Pandare Valley in northeastern Washington state. And so the Pandare Valley, culturally and geographically, it is part of the Columbia-Fraser Plateau, although it does get a little bit more rain than the rest of the plateau. And it's interesting too, because the valley is right up against the Rocky Mountains. And then you actually have mountains on all 3 sides. So you can see the shaded relief here on the screen too. So it kind of covers much of the area. So it's a little bit different topographically than some of the other places throughout the plateau. And so before the construction of many dams, the river would flood seasonally as the snow melted. This would create very fertile floodplains. It would create that swampy area that Camas really loves to grow in, and it is really common to grow. And even now today, even though it doesn't flood the same way it used to, you still have sloughs and drainages. And so Camas still does grow very well here, even if people aren't, if they aren't actively managing the fields, they kind of let it go. You'll see Camas everywhere in this particular valley. So in a couple of weeks, it'll be bright blue. And so the Kalispel people in the plateau, they primarily spent winters in villages in that valley, and then they would travel throughout the summers to hunt, to collect fish, to collect berries, and to harvest other geophytes and root foods as well as Camas. And it is, many historic sources do say that people would come from all over to the valley too, primarily to harvest Camas and to meet with other people. So I worked with the tribe for a while now and was able to visit their curational facility. And the Kalispel Valley Archaeological Project was a very large project run by Washington State in the 80s. And Washington State recently gave the collection back to the tribe too. So this was the first time we were able to use the project or use the collections in conjunction with the tribe in questioning, using questions that they were particularly interested in. And so I went to the project archives, and they had many Camas bulbs that were excavated as part of the project. And I measured over 600 Camas bulbs actually to try to get at selective harvesting in the past. And so I measured length and width and thickness, and I also weighed them and then I could also count the number of visible leaf scales too. So if you see on the screen, often the bulbs would be a little bit broken, probably from excavating or over time or taphonomy. And so then we could actually look at how many leaf scales were part of that bulb without having to break anything. But then there were a lot of whole bulbs too. So I did go through and randomly subsample some of the bulbs too and cut them in half to count the number of leaf scales. So once I was able to cross-correlate with the radiocarbon dates that were produced by the project, as well as a couple extra dates that we were able to get funding for, I found I was left with about 110 bulbs that had leaf scale data as well as radiocarbon dates. And so I used some non-parametric statistics, the Mann-Whitney test, because it's not normally distributed data. And I also used effect sizes to confirm the strength of these associations. And I compared our archaeological Camas bulbs with some of that control data that I produced in my study looking at life history traits of other bulbs, including Camas throughout the greater Western North America. And then I also used, I have a very simple ratio up here too, but Camas bulb volume is really hard to approximate. So I just did, I tried to go for a diameter width plus thickness divided by 2 over length too, just to get roughly a feel for change in size over time without having to figure out what the volume of a 3D teardrop is. So here I have a box plot of some of that leaf scale data, and I organized it by arbitrary 500-year time bins. And so I just wanted to run through a couple quick results too, moving from some of the older data up into the beginning. So the oldest data that we do have from the valley starts at about 4,000 years ago. And looking at the leaf scale data associated with those bulbs, it does appear that people were pulling from all across the age spectrum from, so we did call this strategy stripping in the paper. But then by 3,500 years ago, we do see people predominantly harvesting mostly mature bulbs too. And so it's also at this time, 3,500 years ago, that plateau archaeological summaries pretty widely accept that practices of bulk processing, camas as well as other root crops, really become pretty fully routine at about this time period too. So the dates do match up. And then we don't have data for the 3,000 to 2,500 year period, but from 2,500 to 1,000, it seems to flip-flop quite a bit too. So there's some evidence for stripping, for harvesting mature bulbs, although that only comes from one feature, as well as back to stripping and even some immature bulbs too, which were in the data set. And so what this period though, this 2,500 to 1,000 period though, it corresponds with some fascinating widespread cultural changes. So one of my other interests is in plateau architecture. I have an interest in looking at the houses. And so at this time, throughout the Columbia Plateau, people were living in these substantial and in-ground pit houses, very big, excavated at least a meter into the ground. And sporadically throughout the plateau, people start to abandon living in these houses and they become much more mobile, and they start to adopt these tule mat lodges, which are much more flexible. You can take them with you. You can make them bigger or smaller, depending on the group size too. You also see other changes too. People start to store food in rock shelters. People start to increase trade exponentially, in addition to other forms of change in human mobility and human movement too. And this is a little bit farther away, but we do know that closer to the coast, there is evidence that Camas was traded across hundreds of kilometers too. So this is a period where things are changing too. And so we have preliminary evidence that the Camas data supports some other form of unrest or something different happening too. But then by 1,000 years ago, it does seem that people are primarily harvesting mature bulbs again, and that these practices become established, and this really substantiates some of those traditional descriptions of Camas harvest too, and finds a good time depth to those practices. So I was also interested in seeing if there are any correlations with climate and Camas over time too. So I plotted oxygen isotope data from a nearby lake, not too far away in British Columbia, which is often used as a proxy for precipitation, as well as sea surface reconstructions from near Vancouver Island. And we were just looking to see if there's any environmental influences on the data too. And so the third and bottom panel is that size ratio. I plotted it so we could all see it, and I did it as a dot plot as well, just so you could get a feel for how many numbers are associated with the radiocarbon date. And so just moving again through time, we do see in the sea surface data at 3,000 or so, there is a pretty sharp cooling event too, but we don't have very many Camas dates actually associated with this period. And we also see precipitation increases roughly synonymously with this period as well. And so I don't really think that our lack of data here too is reflective of human behavior. I think it's just chance, because if anything, Camas niches probably would have expanded during this time period too. And I have an idea on how to model those Camas niches in the past too, to really get at understanding a little bit more about where Camas could have actually grown throughout time. And then 2,200 years ago or so, we do see that transition from these cooler and wetter periods to drier periods with much more stabilized precipitation as well too. And so, but this period correlates with that period where people were flip-flopping between strategies too. So again, I don't see any correlations with stabilized precipitation and flipping through your strategies as well. And then finally, from 1,000 years ago on, the precipitation oscillates quite a bit more. But again, we do have those selective harvesting practices taking place. So I also used a non-parametric equivalent of ANOVA to check and see if size and weight vary, and they don't vary significantly through time too, so that one doesn't really pan out. And so I really don't see any evidence that these harvesting practices would have led to selections for increase in size or weight. And I don't see any correlation either here with climate and Camas bulb size or any other responses as well. So I also pretty recently looked at, or in this paper, I looked at another paper that was very recent on geophyte domestication syndrome traits. So geophytes are these root crops, and Camas is a bulb, and it's part of that greater category. And so we looked at archaeological Camas bulbs as well as modern Camas traits too. And we found that some of Camas does exhibit some domestication syndrome traits. So it's pretty easily harvested. You can harvest it across multiple seasons. And then about 15% do reproduce asexually, but we really don't see evidence for all of these domestication syndrome traits. So it's somewhere nebulous. And so we don't say that this is semi-domestication or anything, but we do argue it as a form of management too. And so we argue that this is an alternative pathway. So we have a symbiotic and mutualistic relationship between plants and people that really don't result in any form of permanent or directional phenotypic change that we currently see. And so while much of the origins of agriculture lit actually see these niche construction activities of repetitive cycles of harvesting and sowing and resowing and collecting as the primary processes through which you do get new plant phenotypic and genotypic traits too. But here we have a case study where these human behaviors and these intimate knowledges of plant life cycles don't actually act as selective forces. So you have long-term entanglements and interactions that shouldn't really, again, be thought of as semi-domestication or as incipient agriculture, but rather mutual and flexible relationships with plants that result in pretty versatile and sustainable subsistence practices too. And again, this study is just a preview, so it's just kind of a pilot study of what I would vision would be a larger study throughout Western North America of Camas harvesting through time. And so I've already earmarked a couple collections, archived collections of Camas too, that I have plans to go and take a look at. And I was able to actually look at one already. So this past November, I was able to travel to the University of Oregon and visit their archives. And so the Willamette Valley is also known for its very wide open floodplains and its broad Camas fields too. So the Willamette River also flows north into the Columbia as well too. And again, it's surrounded on three sides by the Cascade Mountains, the Oregon Coast Range, and then there's another mountain range to the south as well. And so it's a pretty similar, although climatic and some vegetation regimes are different, but they're pretty similar, both valleys as far as the case study goes. And so interestingly, vegetation reconstructions too, based on historic records from settlers' diaries and such, they've actually noticed that the valley was probably much more open than it was today. And there's also some really exciting paleofire reconstruction work that's happening in the valley too, which indicates that people are probably keeping those places pretty open and clear using anthropogenic fire too. So I was able to look at the collections. I looked at over 700 bulbs at this particular, from these collections from across 10 different sites, excavated anywhere from the 60s to the 90s too. And I used the same analysis, took those measurements for the ratio and the weight and looked at leaf scales and dissected them too. And so then when we put the radiocarbon dates as well as extra money that we were able to secure for a few extra dates as well too, with all of our bulbs with leaf scale data, we actually have to 330 bulbs this time too. So we were able to expand it a little bit. And so I'm still doing the analysis. I really need to plot out similar paleoclimatic and temperature reconstructions for the valley. But what's fascinating is that I do see some very similar patterns too. So here, what's interesting about the Willamette Valley too, there's one site called Hannibin Creek, and it has, to my knowledge, the oldest archaeological occurrence of Camas. And so it comes from a feature that they have two radiocarbon dates. Both don't really overlap, but they're both in the 7,500 to 8,000-ish range too. So very old. And what we see here with those bulbs though, is that they are both primarily mature as well as they were the largest bulbs of any that I happened to look at per time bin as well too. And then moving up through time, we have a little bit of a break, but from 6,000 to 5,000 and possibly up to 4,000, again, we don't quite have enough numbers to say too much about that. But it does appear that people are primarily stripping, taking bulbs across all ages, or in between, in that weird murky 3-leaf scale is usually it goes either way too. So it's just, we can't really say much about that as well too. But by 3,500 years ago, it does appear that people, again, start to primarily selectively harvest mostly mature Camas bulbs. And then from that point forward, they continue with that pattern as well too. And so that 3,500 year ago mark is thinking more broadly, though, that period is roughly the time where we see people shifting their relationships with plants in many different cultural and geographic regions too. So this is the same time where we start to see selective harvesting in the Pandare Valley. On the Fraser Plateau, even farther to the north, it is argued that, again, that root food production does begin roughly around the same time period. In the Great Basin, people have argued that 3,500 years ago is also when people start to really shift to depending on these root crop foods. And they even argue too that this shift in subsistence is also somehow linked with the locations of winter village settlements and human mobility as well too. So these are just 2 case studies, so it is just a preliminary study, but it does seem worthwhile to see if these patterns persist in other places. And I would like to dig a little bit deeper into these relationships between plant food subsistence choices and human behaviors and some of the other changes that seem to be occurring at the same time too. So by looking at traditional ecological knowledge, the plant's knowledge, and niche construction theory too, I've demonstrated that people were selectively harvesting based on sexual maturity rather than bulb size through time too. And those practices begin by 3,500 years ago and become definitely established, at least in the Pandare Valley, by 1,000 years ago too. And again, so, repetitively sowing and harvesting mature bulbs, and then I have to infer resowing bulbs and I have to infer planting seeds. I don't quite have a way yet to test this archaeologically, but I'm still thinking about it. But I do think that these practices, though, they don't really result in selection for bulb size, which is interesting because we do know that there's a botanist out of Seattle, Luther Burbank, who was able to select for bulb size when he was playing with it and do it within only 2 generations too. And so he thought that Camas would actually take over the potato at the time, which it hasn't, but it could. but just that these practices, that people weren't prioritizing bulb size. Instead, we really do argue that this shows that Camas was managed. You could even say it was stewarded rather than domesticated by our current definitions as well too. And so I argue that this methodology, we could extrapolate it to other bulbous plant foods that people were consuming throughout North America, but it also might be useful for people who are working on understanding these domestication and management pathways with these bulbous or other root crop foods, even globally too. So it might have a lot of potential for other people in not just archaeology, but even in the agricultural sciences too. So as I've mentioned, I have earmarked a couple other collections, and I do plan to start working on this the upcoming summer and hopefully upcoming year too, and setting up times to go and visit these different collections. And I'm always on the lookout for more too. So if anyone hears of anything, I'd love to hear about your Camas. But I also have a couple other projects too that I think could really spin off from this particular project, in addition to expanding this one. I have a couple ideas on how we could incorporate the soil data to get at anthropogenic fire and trying to understand if people were burning to keep some of these fields clear. I also think that thinking back to those life history traits, you can look at when a Camas bulb was harvested and different, thinking about the mother bulb and the daughter bulb and how that might physically represent within bulbs too, and try to get at, exact season when people were harvesting too. And that might tell us about strategies of, are people bulk processing Camas all at once, or are they picking through Camas throughout the season when they need to? So that's one way of answering that question too. And again, I'm also interested in doing a little bit of niche modeling too, to see where Camas could have grown and if it correlates with some of our archaeological data as well too. And so I do have collaborators at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, as well as a couple other tribal nations too, who have agreed to set up test plots so we can ground truth some of this work too, and that we can actually use some of our findings and put them into contemporary land management plans as well. And the goal is to really increase production and access for tribal communities to Camas to really get it at least back into a couple meals a year and maybe a little bit more through time as well. And so this project and these other projects that I've alluded to, they are really designed with and for these First Nation and Native American communities too. And I argue that this braided framework that I outlined today is just an ethical way of going forward and working with communities and also reframing and generating new questions about the past while still producing new knowledge that serves to benefit communities today too. And so that's all that I have for now, but I thank you all again for coming and joining me today and listening in, and I'm excited to talk about it with you now. Sure.
So, yeah, other questions about Camas, so many. Do the differences in sexual maturity, do the plants taste different? Because a lot of plants get bitter with seeds.
I don't know. We usually harvest after they have sent out seeds too, but I don't know if they taste different before or after, and that would be a great thing. The other thing too is that we don't really know. We don't have great, Camas is the only exception, but we really need to look at the nutritional content too of Camas at different parts of the annual life cycle and how different cooking processes might change the complex carbohydrates that are within the plant itself too.
Yeah, totally. That was also one of my next questions. Or if there was any difference in like harvesting efficiency of sexually mature versus not bulbs and yeah.
Maybe when we do the test plots, we can actually get at that too, but it's just not something that I've encountered in the literature.
Yeah, that would be fascinating.
Yeah, cool. I'll try to write it down and maybe we can do it. So do you want to?
There is a question in the chat. Eric, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, hi, Molly. Thanks a lot. That's really interesting. You talk a lot about 3,500 and being a really important period of time. And I'm just curious about what the potential would be for obtaining Camas starch granules from curated groundstone collections so you could potentially build more time depth into your understanding of Camas consumption.
Okay, I think I got most of that. I had a little hard time hearing.
It's in the chat. You can read it.
Oh, wonderful. Thanks. Okay, that's a great question too. So I think Nicole Herzog actually was looking at starch grains associated with some of these plants, and so I don't know if they do produce some starch grains, but not as much starch as some other plants that are common throughout the region too. And I don't know if they are diagnostic to genus or species as well. But I do know that there are. I do know of a couple students who are working on that. One who's working on the Northwest coast too is interested in examining that too. And it would be really fascinating to use that and to look at groundstone and to see if some of these artifacts that we associate with harvesting and processing root crops too, if they're actually being used for Camas or other plants, is another challenging plant as well too. So it is a little bit different. The seeds would look a little bit different. I think that if you were very familiar with the plant, you would be able to know that one. They are in different families too, so different, entirely different taxonomically in how they look, but they do look very similar. They do have white flowers that grow in a similar fluorescence pattern. So I was talking with a woman who does live on the coast, and her ancestors are from the coast too. And she was describing how they would actually put death camas in their plots on the Northwest coast, and they wouldn't tell anyone where they put it. So if someone went to their plots and they were harvesting, they could potentially poison themselves. And that was a way of marking ownership over that particular area. And so that's what keep people from maybe stealing or cheating. So I don't know if that would have been something that you could use too when you're talking about much more broad and open fields as well too. So the landscape definitely plays a part of that. But you should be able to pick up on it when you're out and about in the field. And you probably would if you spotted it, you'd probably get it out of there so it wasn't about to reproduce too.
Could you talk a little bit more about the traditional ecological knowledge that you used in terms of framing your work? So what did that look like?
Well, so before the coronavirus, we had all these plans to meet with people and to work with elders, and to learn about different ways that they contemporarily process plant foods. And I have had the opportunity to work with the Kalispel tribe and to harvest and to bake camas, and to try to dry it out too as well. So this comes from many descriptions of actually on the ground kneeling and digging up camas with people as well as looking into the literature. We had a Camas conference a couple of years ago. So, you know, just there's a lot of interest. A lot of people are really excited about it right now. But the other problem too that I work with the tribe that they've noted is that they wanted to bake camas, but they didn't have a recipe for it. So it's not just camas, it's also the wood that you put in the ovens. It's also, you wrap it in specific leaves. You put other flavorings in there too, and you cook it with lichens. But they didn't have a recipe because that had been lost from colonialism and elders passing away. So that's another thing that we're working on too, is trying to repiece together archaeologically what their recipe was so that they can continue to use it or bring it back into practice today.
So if it's not starchy, what is it, the consistency? Is it more like an onion?
Much more like an onion. So they have very long and complex carbohydrate chains.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to bake it in an oven for like 48 hours to break down those into simpler sugars, or else you're going to have indigestion if you eat it. And so there's some funny passages from Lewis and Clark when they talk about not properly cooking their camas, and how uncomfortable they were. So, so you do have to break it down, and it's a very interesting process. And I know that you can boil camas too, and I don't know the chemical changes, that if there are any differences between boiled versus you would bake and sort of steam it too. It's not something I'm as familiar with, but it's something that is probably worth looking at as well.
Have you looked at, thought about potential impact of animal foraging on camas? It's having some sort of impact in terms of, I know that deer have been reported to consume.
So I haven't looked into that as much, and though I know it has been talked about as far as reducing the productivity of particular plots. But I don't know that much about that. So working in the Pandare Valley, there's all sorts of other good stuff in the forest that the deer would be eating too and living in. So it doesn't seem to be an issue there, but maybe in places where the niches or the places it can grow are a little bit more circumscribed, that it would be an issue, and worth looking into a little bit more.
Talk to Royce.
I will. I got to answer his email tonight. Hopefully I'll have a chance to do that. Someone asked here too, Shelly asked if I've ever tried it, and it does, I have. It tastes kind of like, it's a little more sour than I would expect, but it is sweet. And it's nothing like anything I've ever had before, honestly. So it doesn't taste like an onion, not remotely. It's a little bit, almost like a sour sweet potato, kind of.
Oh.
But not the same texture whatsoever. Does anyone else on Zoom have questions?
Have you looked at any sort of other, you talked about sort of ways that they might have been cooking camas, but do you have an idea of the role camas played in the diet? So what other things are they eating? Do you have any research on that? Diet growth?
Yeah, so at least in the Pandare Valley, salmon were never able to, as far as we know, we're never able to jump over a landmark. So we don't think that salmon was a big factor in diets back then, or at least in the valley for the Kalispel people. We have been trying to, we don't get very great faunal preservation either in the valley too. The soils are very acidic, so the bones just disappear into dust. So we can't really speak too much to the quantity of meat that people were consuming. And then the other thing is too, and I think I've alluded to this in the past, but there's one archaeologist who did a lot of work in the valley and talked about plant food intensification, and he used radiocarbon dates to do that. But when we take a closer look at the actual contents of these earth ovens, we see that people are eating many other things too. So it would really require a very fine-grained reanalysis of the paleobotanical work that has done, as well as some industrial work too, to actually figure out quantities of what people are eating and what they're changing through time. And it needs to be done, and we'll do it eventually, but we don't at this point in time have a really great feel for it. That's also a great question too. Yeah, I do work pretty closely with the Kalispel, and I started off just I just got thrown into working with them, and I had no idea, but they were very kind and opening and welcoming. And so one of the big things that I have picked up with working with them too is just even normal social interactions in ways that you go about your everyday life are a little bit different in how you deal with conflict too. And so being able to pick up on something that might be unspoken through body language or the ways people are acting too has been instrumental in helping to understand what people actually mean when they're saying, and to help move projects forward in a way that they want to see move forward too. And so another thing that we find that seems to work both for all parties too is picking questions that have relevance to the tribe today that the Business Council is interested in. And it's not that we shouldn't look at other questions too, but it's a great way of forming a collaborative partnership and getting people into the site. We'll have open archaeology days where anyone can come by and drop in and hop in the pit, and you show them what's going on, and they love it. And we have science days for kids too. And so we had some old soil samples, and I doctored them with fun points. The kids weren't even interested in that. They were interested in the fire-cracked rock and the charcoal in it too, because that was the real stuff to them. And so making sure that people are actually engaging with it too gets buy-in from the community. Then we get new questions that they're interested in about their ancestors, and it's just a really fulfilling way to work.
I know you've done some work with gender and some of your other projects that you briefly mentioned. And all of the photos that you showed of work with Camas were of women here. Do you perceive any gendered patterns of foraging or even gendered foraging structure in things like settlement locations?
Yes. So that's actually, so the gendered foraging, so my dissertation advisor, Shannon Tushingham, is really into that. And so I don't want to step on her toes and jump on her project ideas, but she is very interested in understanding and trying to quantify women's labor within the overall economy throughout the plateau too, and see, how much people are putting into producing food and harvesting food and storing food, and thinking about the allocation of time and labor and resources with different storaging models. So she's into front-loaded resources like Camas, where you have to put a lot of effort in, versus back-loaded resources. Acorns are a good example, where you just collect them and you store them until you're ready to process them too. But to get at that, we really need some more nutritional data. We need to know how long does it actually take to harvest things. So I've been out to harvest with people, and honestly, men and women all harvest together. The women start it, and then it's like all hands on deck. And then when you go to bake Camas, though, we can have all the men come and help and get everything set up, and then we just kick them out. And then we start the process from there on too. So trying to get at that in the past, though, is going to be a little bit more challenging. But we'd like to. Well, I'd love to. I mean, I'm here for more questions too, but if anyone else has comments too, I'd love to answer them by email as well too. I know I've been talking to quite a number of actually Boise State University students that I met at the Northwest Anthropology Conference. And that's been really delightful. Everyone's had wonderful questions, and we've had some great email chats too. So some perks of the online conference format to come out of this year.
Well, I saw you were on a committee for the NWAC.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you did? Was it the diversity committee? Or?
No, so it's the new professional committee. So I actually have a friend who works at the Washington State Historic Preservation Office. And so we were chatting about what she would like to see in her reports, honestly. She was griping to me a little bit, but she mentioned that she was on this new professionals committee, and then she just looped me into the emails. So then I started joining the meetings, and I worked on a grant writing workshop primarily for students. That was my contribution too, but it was a great resource for students. We got a lot of great feedback and went through, how to apply to a federal job, how to apply to a private job, what are your rights as a field tech during the time of COVID? How do you make sure that you stay safe? So it was pretty well received, and we also got to give out. We were sponsored by a couple of businesses, so we got to get gift cards, and it was really fun. So I really enjoyed it. And I think that the plan is to keep doing it in the future. Every NWAC. Mm-hmm.
All right, well, if there are any more questions, then
All right, well, thank you, everyone.